This segment of WGCU's Untold Stories is underwritten by Collier County Government County Commission, District School Board of Collier County, Collier County Museum, Baron Collier Jr. Foundation, Community Foundation of Collier County.
Remote and isolated, inland from the coastal shores of southwest Florida, Gopher Ridge in the 1800s was home to Seminole Indians and pioneer settlers. With no roads, just trails that wound around ponds and through wetlands, horses and canoes provided the major modes of transportation. Despite that rural isolation, or perhaps because of it, Immokalee, as Gopher Ridge came to be known, evolved into a bustling community where opportunity abounded for those with the vision and gumption to reach out and seize it. This is its story.
The Immokalee area has actually drawn Native American people for thousands of years. A cross-section survey of the state of Florida that was done in 1913 actually shows Immokalee as a veritable mountain. The terrain around here goes from sea level in Fort Myers to almost 40 feet or so around here.
Years before the Seminole Wars, Seminole Indians migrated to South Florida from the north, much like modern-day snowbirds.
The swamp is one of the reasons why they were coming here. They were coming here because of the alligator hides, because of the deer. The animals and the plants that were in the Everglades were drawing these people. It was almost like when the New Yorkers come down for the winter.
What we're on right here is called an alluvial sand dune. It's high, dry ground. It's the highest natural point in Collier County. As a result, Miccosukee and Seminoles had cow pens here because it was high, dry ground, and that's what attracted other people here.
By the end of the Seminole Wars in 1858, the remaining Seminoles lived on informal reservations.
The fact was their summer homes had been destroyed up in Alabama and Georgia. So they came to a place that they'd been living in for at least 100, 150 years before these wars even started.
At that time, Immokalee was known as Gopher Ridge.
The fact that this was a high, dry ridge would mean there were a lot of gopher tortoises, which means that there was plenty of food.
Gopher Ridge, surrounded by wetlands, flourishing with life, would, in time, be forever changed. To foster development and encourage population growth, the state of Florida urged the federal government to drain and reclaim swamp and wetlands.
The federal government, in an act of 1850, deeded all of the swamp and overflowed lands in the states that had them to the state. It's called the Swamp and Overflows Act. And when they did that, the state of Florida was deeded over 20 million acres from the federal government. Now the caveat was that they had to sell those lands to the private sector and use the dollars they generated from those lands to dig canals and levees to help make those lands suitable for cultivation. That land covered basically from Orlando south on the interior of the state, all the Everglades and this area here as well.
But in 1861, the Civil War intervened, and not until after the turn of the century did the 1905 Drainage Act establish the Everglades Drainage District. Near the end of the Civil War, Captain F.A. Hendry, a prosperous cattle rancher who supplied cattle to the Confederate Army, organized his own cow cavalry to round up wild cattle and prevent federal infiltration. Cow pens for collecting those cattle were located on Gopher Ridge.
And then after the war, the federal occupation didn't end until somewhere in the early 1870s, and Florida was broke.
During the Civil War Reconstruction era, F.A. Hendry's cousin, Charles Hendry, returned and built a cabin at Gopher Ridge and continued in the lucrative cattle business. But that ended when his daughter died. Abandoning his homestead, he moved his family to Fort Myers. William Allen, who as a teenager worked for the Cal Cavalry, was driven from Sanibel Island by a hurricane that destroyed his crops and equipment in 1873. He secured permission from the Hendrys to move his family to their abandoned homestead.
It became known as Allen's Place. A guy that was in F.A. Hendry's cattle operation. He was a captain in the Confederate Cal Cavalry, rounding up cows here, and they had cow pens here. And after the Civil War, he came and homesteaded this place for about 40 years. And it was known as Allen's Place.
An Englishman named William Brown made his way to the region while trailing deer. Happening upon Allen's Place, he claimed a spot of land. On returning with his family, he set up trade with the Seminoles.
William H. Brown is my great-grandfather. He was from England. He came over on a ship that set sail. His parents had passed away, from what I understand. When he got on the boat, they had run into some bad weather. And he decided that when he got to land, he wasn't getting back on the boat. And they landed in Cuba. And from the stories I've been told, there was a woman there that hid him in the mangroves. And after the boat set sail, he came out and he got on another boat that was coming up to Fort Myers that was building some line from Cuba at the time. And he set sail on that, and he came here, and he stayed here ever since then.
Brown and his wife Sarah Jane had 4 of their 10 children in Fort Myers before moving to the Immokalee area, where the other 6 were born.
He started a trading post with the Indians. He would trade with the Indians. He would get the furs, and he would take them into Fort Myers on an ox cart, and he would come back with supplies for the Indians.
A national organization founded to protect Native Americans from the encroachment of pioneering settlers came to the region.
In 1891, the Women's National Indian Association bought 400 acres of land, and they were going to establish a reservation. And that was sort of the beginning of Immokalee in a way. But the irony was that Immokalee became so popular that more and more non-tribal people started moving here. And the more people that moved here, the less the Seminoles wanted to live here. So they started actually moving back to their camps in the Big Cypress. So William Brown decided that he was going to actually move out there. And he built Brown's Trading Post at that point where the trail comes into the Big Cypress Swamp.
This is the monument that signified the site of the original William H. Brown boat landing. This is where it was. It actually had a little hospital, a little church here. The Episcopal Church had a church here at one time. Unfortunately, someone came along and broke the monument and took the bronze disc off the top of it.
In 1893, Episcopal Bishop William Crane Gray took over the Women's National Indian Association mission. Working to raise public awareness about Seminoles, he lobbied for government protections, including reservations. Gray built a church near Brown's Trading Post in attempts to better serve and convert the Seminoles and settlers. One Sunday at the church, Gray encountered young Rose Brown. Legend has it that when Gray filled out an application to secure a local post office, he used the name Immokalee, which Rose Brown had told him was Seminole for my home.
About 1905 or so, Brown realized that Governor Broward was about to drain the Everglades. Now, the draining of the Everglades had an incredible effect on the economy and lifestyle of the tribal members, because for one thing, it's kind of hard to paddle a canoe on dry ground.
When Napoleon Broward became governor in 1905, he immediately revived the Everglades Drainage and Reclamation Project. Brown, meanwhile, sold his outpost for $1,500 and moved back into town. There he opened a store where he continued to trade with the settlers and Seminoles.
He saw that the draining of the Everglades was going to go from bringing in thousands of dollars worth of alligator hides in a month, $17 million worth of plumes in a year, to being a barren wasteland that John K. Small referred to as the land of the 10,000 smokes.
The drainage of the Everglades, over time, robbed many of the settlers and Seminoles of their livelihood and destroyed much of their central means of transportation by water. Many adapted, however, by utilizing the drained lands for cattle ranching.
And it actually sort of drove the Seminoles away from that lifestyle in the Big Cypress, because they could no longer depend upon the transportation, the economy, the whole thing fell apart. The Seminoles at this time now had to adapt to the changes of what was going on economically. And they started this migratory lifestyle of doing cattle one time of the year. They would go pick huckleberries another time of the year. They would go down to Moose Isle and to the tourist traps during that season. And they started to adopt a real migratory lifestyle. And at that point, somebody finally came up with reservations. Everything from the Immokalee Reservation, which, the Brighton Reservation, the Big Cypress Reservation, the Hollywood Reservation, and all of these reservations start to become federal. They finally realized a permanent home for these people.
Today, the Seminole tribe of Florida is one of the largest cattle companies in the United States. In 1914, Robert Roberts moved his family and 300 head of cattle from North Florida to their 40-acre ranch in Immokalee.
Well, there wasn't even a dozen families here. It was just wide open spaces, and that's what he was looking for. His aim was to own a large herd of cattle, and he came down here on a trip and saw it, and he wanted to come back.
Many early settlers, like the Roberts, moved to the area with good faith and boundless ambition. Most grew their food and hunted. Some worked the land, producing commodities like sugar syrup.
When the Roberts came here, pretty much sugar around the turn of the century was pretty expensive. Most pioneer families grew their own sugar and had a sugar cane press to extract the juice out of the cane, and then they could put in a jug or transport and take to the stores and trade for things that they needed that they couldn't raise or grow here.
Pioneers traded sugar syrup for items such as gunpowder, flour, salt, and clothing. By the 1960s, the Roberts family grew their original modest homestead ranch into the massive Red Cattle Company.
They started out with 40 acres that they homesteaded, and by the late 50s, early 60s, they had amassed over 110,000 acres that they owned or leased, putting them in the top 10 cattle ranches in Florida.
But more changes were in store for Immokalee. The railroad was coming. The Atlantic Coastline Railroad extended a spur to Immokalee in 1921. Providing a much-needed link between the budding community and the outside world. Mill Roberts Sherrod was 2 years old at the time.
They brought ice, for one thing. They picked ice up the road and brought it into Immokalee. That was the first ice that was delivered here. It gave us a way out if we wanted to. They had a passenger car. I rode it to Lakeland to go to school.
The railroad is kind of what opened up a lot of things. With the coming of the railroad, then the timber industry became viable.
It was a total of 5 mills in here to cut the timber. Now this is in the 30s, 1935 on. And it looked like the same place 10 years later when they cut out all this beautiful timber. Shipped out, most of it went by on trucks, some of it by railroad.
During that time, the population of Immokalee soared to over 500 residents. Mill Roberts married William Sherrod of the Sherrod Sawmill family.
We're married in this house, right here. And about a year later, the mills moved. So we moved from here up to Inverness and Crystal River and just kept moving on up to North Florida and then into Georgia for 5 years and then back into Florida. And I got back home about 1949, I believe it was. So I didn't want to leave again.
Huey Howard made his way to Immokalee in the 50s with the dream of making a living doing what he loved.
Well, I just liked it farm work, and I just liked to work on the farm and be around farm work, and that's why I really wanted to come to Immokalee. And when I first came to Immokalee, it was the sawmill on First and Main.
By then, the railroad had become Immokalee's lifeline.
They was hauling in feed for the cattle, and they used to unload feed various locations. And back then, I think they used to sell everything here. Everything for here was freighted on the train.
Howard and his wife Dorcas turned their vision of having a cattle ranching business into a reality.
We finally was able to get a piece of land to lease, so we leased a piece of land and we started raising cows. Right here in Immokalee, right behind the old driving license office. We had about 160 acres there, and then we started leasing land other places. And then we finally got around to where we could buy a piece of land, and we bought a piece, and we put cows on our own land.
In 1923, Immokalee became part of the newly formed Collier County, which was created from the southern part of Lee County. Baron Collier, who founded the new county, had purchased over 1 million acres in southwest Florida. Envisioning a dynamic future for the region, he funded the completion of Tamiami Trail that connected Tampa and Miami. The cattle industry, meanwhile, continued to grow, attracting many more ranchers to the area. In the early 1900s, the distinction between privately owned and government-owned land was blurred. Unconfined by modern fences, Florida's prairies were wide open. The state hired a group of men, including Percy Brown, Pete Townsend, Robert Rollison, and others to aid ranchers. They became known as the Range Riders.
A lot of land was still owned by the government. A lot of land that was owned wasn't fenced, and a lot of cattlemen just put their cattle out in the woods and let them graze and produce their young. When they gathered the cattle, usually once a year, all of the ranches would send representatives to the gathering to make sure that their cattle got branded for their brand and so on down the line. In 1923, the state and federal government entered into a mandatory dipping program to get rid of the Texas fever tick, which we'd had since 1900.
Livestock infected with the Texas fever tick were likely to die. If they didn't die, they became difficult to sell. To stem the outbreak, the government imposed a mandatory order that all cattle be dipped in an arsenic compound mixture that killed the tick.
Well, this is the old Sick Island dipping vat that was constructed in 1933. The cattle came in from the other end down there. They jumped off into the vat and usually submerged themselves and then swam to this end, and there's a little set of ladder steps, if you whatever you want to call them, that the cows could get on and climb back out into where we're standing. And this was called a drip pen. And the cattle would be held in here for several minutes to let the excess drip fall off, drain off of the animals, and it would drain back into the vat so it could be reused.
It was serious, you know. They had range riders that come in behind you if you didn't gather all the cattle. My daddy done some of the range riding. If a man didn't gather all his cattle, the range riders come in behind him, you know, and gather the cattle and make sure they got them dipped.
They started in North Florida, and by the time they got down here, it was 1932. And they went to trying to gather these cattle, and they run into all those wild cattle that had been abandoned back in the 20s. So they had to hire the range riders, and my dad was one of them, Percy Brown, Robert Rollison, and there were a lot of others. They were hired to try to first gather them, but was found pretty soon they couldn't gather them, so they were ordered to kill them out, and they did.
Approximately 300 head of wild cattle were eradicated.
They hunted those cattle like you would deer. They would find where those cattle had been and they would trail them. Some had dogs, some didn't, some just were woodsmen like my daddy and Pete Townsend and people like that. They were woodsmen enough that a lot of times they didn't even use a dog. They just simply trail a cow or a bull up, till they found him.
But then it was discovered that deer carried the fever tick. So to prevent spreading the tick to cattle, the state built a battery-operated 8-foot-high so-called deer fence to keep the deer south in the swamp and away from cattle. Many range riders helped build and manage the electric deer fence.
A lot of them were re-employed to build the fence once the wild cattle were killed out, because most of them got killed out by 1934. It was during the Depression, and jobs were scarce. They were getting paid, I think, $1.50 a day to do that sort of work.
The deer fence prevented some of the spread of the fever tick, but not enough. Desperate, the state ordered the range riders to eradicate thousands of deer. Seminoles joined some of them in the hunt.
My daddy said he thought close to 15,000 deer was killed during that period. Now there's pros and cons about that number, but he was one of the inspectors. He was one of the boss over a crew, that killed those deer. And that's when the Indians got involved with some of the deer killing.
Some of those hunters became legendary.
Percy was one of the best trackers that ever walked on 2 feet. But he had a master in front of him, and that's the reason he was good. Daddy was just a shade better. The way Percy killed them deer, he killed a few of them with a headlight at night, but most of them he'd go find a big deer's track, and he'd trail that deer up by eyesight, and that's the way he killed most of them.
Hunting served 2 central purposes. It provided money and helped the hunters feed their families.
So I had no .38 pistol. I just gave it to my daughter, and I bought that thing, Lord, when I was, 14, 15 years old. I'd kill bear, kill panther, kill deer, kill turkeys with it, cattle, and everything else.
People may not understand this, but you could not afford to buy too much meat. You bought bacon, but you didn't buy too much beef. You bought hamburger when you bought it. And if you bought a round steak, it was a rare thing at my house. My father killed hogs, deer, and turkey. And we ate that most of the time. And whether it was legal or not, that's the way it was.
The rural isolation that greeted settlers in Gopher Ridge still permeates the landscape of what is now Immokalee. But instead of being a hardship to overcome, it is now a magnet for those seeking a simple life in a rural haven.
I think Immokalee is really the place, if you want to be in the farming area, you need to be in Immokalee. Immokalee is a beautiful farming area, and I just love to be in the outdoors. I don't want to be up in the office. I want to be outside, so I love to be on the farm, and I just love it.
At nearly 1,500 acres, Lake Trafford is the largest lake south of Lake Okeechobee. It spans the headwaters of the Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. Recent discoveries in Lake Trafford have provided archaeologists with valuable new insights into the historical significance of the region.
Well, this is the evidence that clearly puts the Collier Indians and their ancestors here at Lake Trafford. We know there were settlements in this area for quite some time, probably 900,000 years ago. And because of the low water levels this year, we have seen some of the canoes that were either abandoned, left behind, or were in the process of being built.
Here on the lake, we have found probably around 20 or 30. Now the state is doing the research now to try to gather as much data as they can. on exactly who, when, and how these things wound up over here. They GPS these sites, and they must have did 10, 15 pictures of every square foot of it, if you ask me. And they will have that information recorded now. Like I said, it's been well over 100 years since this lake's been this low. So they're probably recording things that hadn't ever been recorded for future generations to know.
So, as the ancient Calusa, Seminoles, early settlers, pioneer entrepreneurs, and 20th century cattlemen marched across Gopher Ridge, they left indelible footprints in its fertile soil. But the winds of change and the abundant opportunities they brought with them kept blowing. As World War II drew to a close, a wave of hope and optimism and prosperity swept across the lands. And in Immokalee, a new era was on the horizon for those who called it my home.
This program was produced for the citizens of Southwest Florida by WGCU Public Media. Show your appreciation for programs like these. Become a member of WGCU, a business supporter, or leave a legacy through estate or planned gift. Call or visit our website at WGCU.org.
To order a DVD of this program, call 1-888-824-0030 or go to WGCU.org.